Today we are looking at a new rout, this time in the Far East, over China's air defense zone, declared earlier this week, declared unilaterally basically by Beijing. China's ADIZ requires aircraft to provide their flight plan, declare their nationality, and maintain two-way radio communication over the Shikoku Islands.
Well, the Shikoku Islands, the Shikoku is the Japanese name of the islands known as Diaoyu in China.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the uninhabited islands, yet they seem to be of major strategic importance.
Mm-hmm.
And several years ago, tensions re-emerged over these islands after a period of calm. So this is not exactly surprising that the Chinese are now trying to reassert their position on those disputed territories.
But let's just remember the latest developments in this whole zone. That American B-52 bombers first flew throughout that zone without actually declaring its intent to go there, without complying with the requirements of the Chinese. Then, now we've seen aircraft from Japan and South Korea doing the same thing. And China maintains that this information on these flights should still be provided if these nations are going through their air territory. But apparently, neither side really wants to back down and give in to the other side.
Well, I'll tell you what, the reaction to the news that China has established unilaterally, like you're saying, a zone of this kind, has triggered off a lot of emotional responses on the part of both the Americans, the regional players. And of course, the response of the Chinese military to the incident with the B-52 bombers and other aircraft from Japan and from South Korea, by the way.
Which I mentioned. Uh-huh.
Absolutely. Well, it was quite unemotional. Just let me read it from their statement. They said that its military, I quote, monitored the entire process of the B-52 flights, and the Ministry of Defense of China never expressed either regret or anger or no threats.
Well, apparently, I guess Beijing doesn't really want to engage into a war right now, but it wants to establish its foot in the region, definitely showing its intent to expand its territories, as far as I can understand. Its military budget has been increased fivefold for the next 10 years, now to $102 billion. These are all signs that China is making a presence in the region, in the East China Sea.
Which is quite natural, because this is its region.
Well, yeah, okay, but it's also a priority region for the U.S. and its Pacific Fleet, and for Japan, of course. You know, we all remember a country with a pretty dense population and very little territory, which has already always wanted to at least hold its grasp on something it has claimed earlier on.
Well, precisely because Japan seems to have territorial disputes with every single neighbor. However, getting back to the situation with the zone, I think that the major challenge now comes not from China, but from the reaction of the international community to that news, because everyone is professing that this is going to develop into another sensitive point in the region and could ultimately bring to new conflicts. In fact, this is a position which was expressed to the Burning Point by Thomas Koenig, who is China Program Coordinator at the European Council for Foreign Relations.
If you remember, basically, when the nationalization of the Senkaku and Diaoyu Islands happened in the end of 2012, China has ever since been starting some sort of a campaign, basically, to reassert its claim over those islands. And this air defense zone, in my opinion, is just the latest example of China trying to encroach upon the Japanese hold on this, part of the world. I do think that it has backfired immensely, because while they had protests in the late 2012, they had smaller escalations in the beginning of 2013. This is just the latest example of a huge escalation of the whole thing, with now the United States stepping up and actually reasserting its own position within the region, and also clearly siding with Japan and their security claim on the region. So this challenge by the United States is kind of expected, because China has just been pushing the envelope a little bit too far.
So, and how do you see things are going to develop further? Because I'm not sure that the Chinese would step back in that situation.
The thing is, to be quite honest, I'm thinking about it right now, because, right now they're trying to kind of test the waters, so to say, in the sense of how far can they actually go. And I think they did not expect that kind of a concerted show of, if I don't want to call it power, but at least of resolve on the side of the Americans who are actively challenging it. So I do think that they're going to at least reconsider their position. It might be that they might be decreasing the size of the borders of the air defense zone, or that they might be granting special access to, regional players such as the United States. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a set thing that China is not going to backtrack. I know official statements are that, of course, conflict is not impossible, but then again, it would be in no one's interest to have this situation escalate.
And what is the position of Japan in this situation? Because one of the latest news I heard from Japan is that they're considering to establish a Council of National Security, and that is a clear signal.
So they basically, ever since the announcement of the third plenum, because, this whole thing and this national security apparatus by China is an initiative by, the latest leadership. Japan has been kind of warily eyeing this whole situation and has been very worried about it. The thing is, is this going to be a game for tit for tat, where basically Japan is just going to be deciding to, basically emulate the same thing China is doing, which could invariably lead to further escalation, or, which has been Japan's strategy for a long while, they just might as well just look at what the United States is doing, as after all, they have an agreement to receive protection from the United States. And I think the most prudent path for Japan right now would be to just warily watch what the United States are doing and just be glad that basically the United States is kind of challenging this air defense zone so they don't have to do it. But of course, with rampant nationalism and also those anti-Chinese sentiments that are rampant in Japan as well, it is possible that this whole situation could, of course, escalate. However, again, I would just like to emphasize that I think that would be the least preferable outcome of the whole situation. So if Japan is prudent, they would just take a step back and let America flex their muscles.
That was Thomas König, China Program Coordinator at the European Council for Foreign Relations.
Burning Point.
So, as we can well see, the challenges are many and the concerns are many. And this is something we've been discussing with our next guest speaker, Dr. Yu Zi, Professor in Politics and International Relations at the University of New South Wales in Australia.
There are quite a number of reasons. For example, Japan has imposed the air defense identification zone, and the zone has been quite intruding well into the Chinese near coast and near sea, for example. So each time when the Chinese aircraft or naval vessels get into the Japanese air defense identification zone, the Chinese vehicles and the vessels would be encountered, sometimes even harassed by the Japanese aircraft or naval vessels under the so-called the Air Identification Zone engagement rules. And it looks like the Chinese are the intruders. This is one of the reasons. Second reason is that the air identification zone would give the Chinese some more early warning time, so China could be prepared to intercept any hostile aircraft or naval vessels into the Chinese territorial waters or airspace.
So, do I get it right that the decision makers in China were prepared for the international reaction to this decision?
That is understandable. I think the Chinese have well anticipated the responses, especially from the Americans and the Japanese, because it is the air identification zone by the Japanese and the Americans. So the new Chinese air defense identification zone overlaps the Japanese area. So the Japanese will think that it was act of changing the status quo. But for the Chinese, the previous status quo, as represented by the Japanese air identification zone, was unfair and was unilaterally imposed a long time ago. So the Chinese only did something as a countermeasure. Of course, that would probably put the Japanese and Americans in a position to accustom to or adjust to a new rules of the game in the region.
Well, but then, when the decision has been taken to impose this kind of zone, that is also connected with certain kind of limitations on the actions of the Chinese military. For instance, now the BBC has reported that not only the American aircraft has trespassed the zone, but also the Japanese and the South Korean. And of course, the reaction on the part of the Chinese military has been pretty much restrained. But how do we protect this situation from other kinds of, provocations, if I may? And in that sense, what the Chinese are going to do?
Oh, I think those flights, for example, by the Americans, B-52s and the Japanese aircraft, I think they do not pose any security threat to the Chinese, and the reaction is understandable because the Russians and Chinese never recognize the Japanese air defense identification zone, so they often, fly over these zones without telling the Japanese or Americans. So this was quite reciprocal. And for these two incidents by the Americans and the Japanese, now let's say go a little bit deeper of the American flights, they were flying in parallel to the Chinese coast and hundreds of miles away from the Chinese airspace. Therefore, it was largely a symbolic act rather than a direct challenge. And the Japanese did the same thing. So for the Chinese, there was no imminent security and military threat to the Chinese. So there is no reason for Chinese to respond to these kind of symbolic flights in a, for example, vigorous or hostile way.
Well, it seems that the tension has been escalating between the sides in this zone, and it doesn't seem that China was willing to back off from its plans to declare this air defense zone, and neither is Japan or the United States willing to reconsider this as their key priority in the Pacific region. Now, who is likely to back off, or are we to see some kind of head-on collision?
No, I don't think there will be any collision. It's basically a matter of management of those kind of tensions. And specifically, as far as I see it, tensions are basically in the form of war of words rather than real action. And everyone in Washington, in Tokyo, and Beijing knows how to conduct this kind of game anyway. And there will not be confrontation. As you know, the American flights testified that the flights were an indicator of displeasure rather than direct challenge. I think after some time, three capitals, China's capital Beijing or Tokyo and Washington, would have to reconcile with this new fact that there was a Chinese imposed air defense identification zone. For the Chinese, I think, of course, Beijing has to be very, very careful not to overstep in terms of, for example, law reinforcement within the air identification zone. The Chinese made it very, very clear. This is air defense identification zone. It's not no-fly zone, and it is not a zone of combat. And this is a mechanism of, as I interpret it, as preemptive or preventative mechanism of crisis control rather than an immediate aggressive act to arouse some military confrontation. Therefore, it is a matter of how to manage it. For the Chinese, they would be very, very careful. And unless they identify this aircraft in a really hostile movement towards the Chinese airspace, the Chinese probably would ignore most of those flights. They were not really in violation of Chinese national and security interests.
That was Dr. Yu Zi, professor in politics and international relations at the University of New South Wales in Australia.
So the situation is really tense. However, as far as I understand, one of the major problems is that we somehow do not hear clear arguments coming from the Chinese side.
So you never know what exactly they're thinking right now.
I don't hear their arguments because when we were listening to the interview from Dr. Yu Zi, his reasoning is quite crisp and clear and quite logical, something the news media just does not provide us with.
Okay, or Chinese authorities do not provide news media with.
Well, anyway, this is a huge suspense, and this is something with which we end the first part of Burning Point.